They say betrayal never comes from strangers. I learned that truth one winter evening, standing in the farmhouse kitchen I had built with my own 2 hands. My brother looked me straight in the eye, slammed his palm on the table, and said, "The farm is mine now." His voice was hard, final, like a man delivering a sentence he believed could not be overturned. And then, as if the blow wasn't already heavy enough, my own son, my only boy, leaned back in his chair and said, "If you don't agree with him, you won't be invited to Christmas dinner." The air left my chest that night. The son I had raised, the boy I had worked myself to the bone for, siding with the very man who had envied me my whole life. It was like watching the walls of my home collapse in slow motion. But what they didn't know, what they never expected, was that I wasn't a man so easily erased. And when I walked into that Christmas gathering with my lawyer and the will itself, the room went quiet. The farm, the legacy, the truth, all of it was mine. And this time, the law was on my side. Before I tell you how it all unfolded, let me pause for a moment. Please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. I always find it comforting to know the towns, the states, even the countries where people hear these stories. Because betrayal, as painful as it is something too many of us understand. My name is Daniel Carr, and I am 72 years old. I have lived on this land all my life. It's not just dirt and fences to me. It's the place where my father first taught me how to plow when I was barely tall enough to hold the reins. It's where my mother hung laundry on summer afternoons while I ran through the fields chasing grasshoppers. It's where I brought my wife after our wedding, building her a home from timber I cut myself. And it's where I raised my children, teaching them that honest work was worth more than easy money. I gave everything to this farm. Every season was a sacrifice, long days in the sun, longer nights worrying about frost or drought. There were years when the crops failed, when I thought about selling, when I sat at this very table with my head in my hands, wondering how we'd make it through the winter. And yet, somehow, we always did. Not because it was easy, not because anyone handed us anything, but because I refused to let go of the land my parents entrusted to me. My father used to say, "Daniel, the land remembers who works it. It holds the sweat, the tears, the calluses. It knows its keeper." And I believed that. I still do. That's why the words from my brother and my son cut so deep. You expect life to hand you hardships, weather, bills, aching bones, but you don't expect the knife to come from family. I can endure storms. I can endure age. But to endure the sight of my own flesh and blood treating me like an obstacle in their path, that is something different. I'll admit something here. When my brother first started making remarks about the farm, little comments about how Dad had always said he'd look after it one day, I didn't take him seriously. We were boys together once, riding horses through these same fields, splitting chores in the barn. He was reckless, always was, spent more time in town than in the soil. When our father died, the will was clear. The land was mine. My brother didn't fight it then, though I saw the bitterness in his eyes. He walked away, tried his hand at other trades, but none stuck. And now here he was, decades later, standing in my kitchen, acting like time and lawn labor meant nothing, declaring the farm his, as if words alone could erase 40 years of sweat. But the greater wound didn't come from him. No, the greater wound came from the man who sat beside him, my son, my boy who had grown up bottle-feeding calves, riding the tractor in summers, learning how to mend a fence post by watching me. I had poured my life into him, paid for his college, bought him his first truck, covered his debts when he stumbled in his 20s. And still, when the moment came, he chose his uncle's side. Why? Because greed is louder than gratitude. Because promises of easy gain sound sweeter than lessons of hard work. Because sometimes the blood you shed on the land means nothing to those who inherit the shade of your labor. I went to bed that night with my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give out. The walls of my house, once filled with laughter and Christmas songs, felt hollow. My wife, God bless her, put her hand on mine and said softly, "Daniel, don't let anger take your soul. There's a reason this is happening now." I didn't understand what she meant then, but I would soon, because betrayal, as cruel as it feels, sometimes opens the door to a truth you've been avoiding. For me, it was this, that I had been giving too much power away, that I had allowed love and loyalty to blind me from protecting what was rightfully mine, and that if I didn't act, I would lose not just my land, but my dignity. And so, with Christmas only weeks away, I began preparing, quietly, methodically, not with fists or shouts, but with something stronger, with the truth, with the law, and with the will that my father had signed long before my brother ever dreamed of claiming what wasn't his. When you've lived your whole life in one place, the land itself begins to feel like family. Every corner of this farm holds a memory, like pages in a book only I can read. The big oak by the south field, that's where my father taught me how to sharpen an axe without nicking my thumb. The old barn with the red paint peeling, that's where my mother used to call us in for supper, her voice carrying across the fields louder than any dinner bell. I sometimes wonder if people who grow up in cities understand this kind of bond, the kind where dirt under your fingernails feels like an honor, not a burden, where sweat on your brow is proof of a good day, not something to be wiped away quickly. This land wasn't just where I worked. It was where I became the man I am. I remember one winter back in the 70s, when a storm came down harder than anything we'd seen in decades. Snow piled against the doors until we had to dig tunnels just to get to the barn. The cattle were shivering, frost gathering on their hides. I spent 3 nights sleeping in that barn, bundled in old quilts, keeping the kerosene lamps burning, making sure not a single animal froze to death. My wife brought me hot coffee in a thermos every morning, trudging through snow up to her knees just to keep me going. That's the kind of love that built this farm. That's the kind of commitment that kept it alive. Every scar on my hands, every ache in my back, is tied to this soil. When I walk through the fields at dawn, the earth itself feels like it recognizes me. My father used to say, "The land remembers, son. It knows who has cared for it." I've carried that saying with me my whole life, and I believe it, because this farm has seen me at my strongest and my weakest, and it has never let me down. When my children were little, they'd run barefoot through the pastures, chasing each other until the sun sank low. I can still hear their laughter echoing over the fields. My daughter Annie used to pick wildflowers by the fence line and bring them to her mother, tiny bouquets wrapped in grass stems. My son, he was bold, always trying to climb the hay bales higher than I allowed, grinning ear to ear when he reached the top. Those are the memories that made me believe I was doing it right, that all the sweat, the sleepless nights, the missed vacations were worth it. Because I wasn't just raising crops, I was raising a family. There were times we had nothing but beans on the table, but somehow the house never felt empty. We celebrated Christmases with homemade ornaments and hand-sewn stockings. We built traditions that no amount of money could buy. I thought, foolishly maybe, that those traditions meant something unshakable, something my children would carry with them as they grew older. The farm wasn't just mine. It was meant to be ours, a place of continuity, a living legacy. My parents worked these fields before me. Their sweat mingled with mine in the soil. And I had always believed my children would continue the same rhythm, that when my time came, they would walk the rows with the same reverence, the same love. I never imagined that one day, the very people I thought I was building this for would stand against me, that my brother, who had long abandoned these acres, would return not with gratitude, but with greed, that my son, who once clung to my overalls while I guided the plow, would look me in the eye and tell me I wasn't welcome at Christmas. But betrayal doesn't announce itself ahead of time. It creeps in slowly, in whispers and shadows, until suddenly it stands before you like a thunderstorm. Looking back, I see the signs were there. My brother's casual comments about Dad wanting him to have the land. My son's questions about paperwork and property lines. I brushed it off, thinking they were just idle words. I thought love and loyalty were stronger than greed. I thought wrong. Still, even as I sit here and tell you this, I can't help but remember the beauty. I can still see my wife's smile the first spring we planted corn together, both of us covered in dirt and laughing like children. I can still smell the hay bales in July, sweet and sharp in the heat. I can still hear the sound of rain on the tin roof, a lullaby that soothed us through countless nights. This farm is more than a piece of property. It is a testament to resilience, to family, to faith. And maybe that's why it hurt so much when they tried to take it from me, because they weren't just claiming land. They were trampling on memories, on sacrifices, on a lifetime of work that could never be measured in dollars or deeds. Sometimes I walk the fence line at dusk, watching the sky turn orange and gold, and I think about how many generations of carmen have stood in this same place. My grandfather, his hands rough as sandpaper. My father, who taught me that dignity was worth more than money. And me, who tried to pass that same lesson down. That's the chain of legacy. That's what makes land sacred. And yet, my brother wanted to cut that chain. My son wanted to trade it for a seat at a different table, a Christmas where I was the outsider. They saw only value, not meaning. They saw only ownership, not stewardship. I tell you all this because you need to understand what was at stake. This wasn't just about fields or fences. This was about memory, about legacy, about the weight of decades that can't be put into a bank account. And when betrayal came knocking, it wasn't just my land they threatened. It was everything that made me who I am. Betrayal doesn't always arrive with a shout. Sometimes it begins with whispers you convince yourself not to hear. Looking back, I realize the warning signs were there long before the night my brother slammed his hand on my table and claimed my land. It started with small comments. One evening after Sunday supper, my brother leaned back in his chair, chewing on a toothpick the way he always did, and said, "You know, Dad always told me I'd look after this place someday." I laughed at the time. He told me the same thing. That's why he left it to me in his will. He smirked, the kind of smirk that never reached his eyes. Maybe he meant both of us. I brushed it off. Brothers tease each other. Brothers exaggerate. But there was something sharp beneath his tone, something that clung to me like a burr on my sleeve. Not long after, he started showing up, unannounced. I'd be out in the fields, mending a fence, and there he'd be, leaning on the post like he owned the place. He'd talk about what we should do with the land, plant soybeans instead of corn, sell off the north pasture, maybe even lease part of it out. I'd remind him gently, "This is my farm, brother. Always has been." He'd just grin and say, "We'll see." At first, I thought it was nothing more than envy speaking. He'd never held on to work for long. Jobs came and went. Schemes started and fizzled. Meanwhile, this farm remained, steady and strong. I could understand how a man like him might resent that. What I didn't see was how deep that resentment had grown. Around that same time, I noticed a change in my son. He used to come by on weekends, eager to help with chores, eager to hear stories about how his grandfather ran things. But slowly, his visits shifted. He stopped asking about the land with wonder. Instead, his questions turned sharper. "Dad, do you have the deed papers somewhere safe?" "Dad, what happens to the farm if something happens to you?" "Dad, wouldn't it make more sense to let Uncle help manage things?" The first time he asked, I chuckled and said, "Son, I'm still here. Nothing's happening to me anytime soon." But the look he gave me wasn't concern, it was calculation, as if he were already picturing a future where I wasn't in the picture. That look unsettled me more than I care to admit. He was my boy, the one I'd carried on my shoulders across these fields. And yet, there was a distance in his eyes, a coldness that didn't belong to the child I remembered. The next red flag came one afternoon when I found one of my tractors missing from the shed. I thought perhaps one of the hired hands had taken it down to the south field. Instead, I found my brother driving it, cigarette dangling from his mouth as if it were his own. "What do you think you're doing?" I shouted across the field. "Relax, Dan," he called back. "Just taking her for a spin. What's family for?" I clenched my fist but let it go. Foolishly, I let it go. That's the thing about family. You want to believe their intentions are good, even when the evidence says otherwise. You tell yourself it's just a misunderstanding, just a slip, just a moment. But those moments pile up. Not long after, during a family dinner, the tension finally broke the surface. My brother poured himself a drink, looked around the table, and said, "It's a shame you're still running this place like it's the 1950s, Dan. Could have been making a fortune if you'd let me handle things." I tried to keep the peace. "This farm has supported us just fine." He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. "Because of me, you'd be twice as rich. Maybe it's time you handed over the reins." And then, like a knife twisting, my son laughed. Not a nervous laugh, a supportive one. As if he agreed. That laugh cut deeper than any of my brother's words. After supper, I pulled my son aside. "What's going on with you? Since when do you side with your uncle over your own father?" He shrugged, eyes cold. "Uncle has good ideas. Maybe it's time you stop being so stubborn." Stubborn. That word echoed in my ears long after he left. I had spent my life breaking my back to provide for him. Stubborn was what had kept this farm alive through droughts and floods. Stubborn was what had kept food on his plate when times were lean. And now, stubborn was his insult. The days that followed were filled with unease. My brother kept showing up, nosing around, making comments about our land. My son grew distant, his calls shorter, his visits filled with pointed questions about ownership. One evening, I walked into the barn and found the family Bible lying open on a workbench, the page marked with our father's handwriting. Next to it was a stack of papers my brother had been rummaging through, old records, receipts, documents that had no place in his hands. I realized then, this wasn't idle talk. He was preparing for something. And my son was helping him. I stood in that barn, the smell of hay and dust in the air, and felt something shift inside me. The land had always been my anchor, but suddenly it felt like the very ground beneath my feet was trembling. They weren't just circling, they were moving in, and though I didn't know it then, the storm was only beginning. It happened on a night colder than most, the kind where frost creeps along the windows and silence presses down heavy on the house. I had invited my brother and my son inside, thinking, foolishly, that we might talk like family, put an end to the unease that had been brewing for weeks. We sat at the old oak table in the kitchen, the same table where my father once bowed his head to say grace before every meal. The wood bore the scratches of decades, each mark a story. Children carving initials, tools laid down carelessly, hot pans leaving faint burns. That table had survived storms, hunger, and quarrels, but it had never borne witness to what was about to be said. My brother leaned forward, his elbows spread wide, and looked me dead in the eye. His voice was calm, too calm. "Dan, let's stop pretending. The farm is mine now." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. I blinked, the words rattling around in my skull like loose nails. "Yours," I repeated. He nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Dad always intended it. You know it. I've got the papers to prove it." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because disbelief was the only thing holding back my anger. "The will was clear. This land came to me, not you." He smirked, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket and tossing it onto the table. "Things change. Deeds get amended. People forget details. I didn't even have to open it to know something was wrong. The paper looked official, stamped, but I knew the truth. My father never signed anything that cut me out. This was forgery, plain and simple." Before I could speak, my son shifted in his chair. He'd been quiet until then, eyes darting between us, jaw tight. And then he said the words that broke something in me forever. "Dad, maybe you should just let him have it. If you keep fighting, you're not welcome at Christmas dinner." The room went silent. Even the old clock on the wall seemed to stop ticking. I stared at him, searching his face for some sign that he didn't mean it, that maybe the words had come out wrong. But there was nothing, just a flatness in his eyes, a coldness I had never seen before. "You're telling me," I whispered, "that if I don't hand over the land your grandfather left me, the land I've worked for half a century, I won't be invited to my own family's Christmas?" He looked away. "It's not just about you, Dad. Uncle's right. You're too old to keep running things. Maybe it's time you passed it on." Passed it on. As if it were a set of keys, not a lifetime of blood and sweat. As if the soil beneath our boots meant nothing more than numbers on a page. I felt my chest tighten. "Son," I said softly, "when you were 6 years old, you followed me into the fields at sunrise. You carried a wooden toy tractor, said you were going to be just like me. Do you remember that?" His jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. "I thought I was building all this for you," I went on, my voice breaking. "Every hour I worked, every night I stayed awake worrying about bills, I thought I was securing your future. And now you sit here telling me I'm not welcome in my own family unless I give it away?" My brother chuckled darkly. "Don't be so dramatic, Dan. You had a good run. Now it's my turn." "Your turn," I shot back. "Where were you when the barn roof caved in during the storm of '85? Where were you when I spent weeks nursing cattle through the winter? Where were you when I sold my truck just to pay for seed after a bad harvest?" He shrugged. "Doesn't matter. I'm here now, and I've got the paperwork to back me up." The gall of him, the utter shamelessness, made my blood boil. But worse than that was my son's silence. He didn't defend me. He didn't question his uncle's so-called papers. He just sat there, complicit. Finally I stood, my chair scraping against the floor. My voice was low, steady, but every word burned. "Neither of you has earned a single inch of this land. Not one. And if you think threats about Christmas or forged papers will change that, you don't know me as well as you think." My son rose too, his face hard. "Then don't come. We'll celebrate without you." That was the killing blow. Not the words themselves, but the conviction behind. Them. My own flesh and blood, willing to erase me from the table where I once carved the turkey, where he once sat on my lap to open presents. I wanted to shout. I wanted to smash that false deed across the table. But instead, I turned away. I walked to the mantel where a family photo rested, taken years ago. In it, we were smiling, me, my wife, my children, the farm stretching green behind us. I picked it up, stared at it, then set it face down. "You've made your choice," I said quietly. "Both of you." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. When they left that night, their boots clattering across the porch, the house felt colder than ever. Not because of the winter wind, but because the warmth of family had been ripped out. And yet, as I stood in that empty kitchen, one thought began to take root. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. But not with fists, not with shouting, with the truth, with the law, and with the will that still carried my father's name. The silence after they left was worse than their words. My brother's boots thudded heavy on the porch steps, my son's footsteps echoing behind him, and then the door closed. The sound rang through the house like a coffin lid sealing shut. For a long time, I didn't move. I just stood in that kitchen, staring at the place where the forged paper had lain on the table. The table was empty now, but it still carried the weight of what had been said. My brother claiming the farm, my son threatening to cut me out of Christmas. It wasn't just an argument, it was a fracture, a break that could never be undone. I lowered myself into my chair, the same chair I had sat in for decades of family dinners. My hands shook as I pressed my palms against the worn wood, feeling grooves left by years of use. This table had seen laughter, prayers, holidays, tears. Tonight it had seen betrayal. The photo on the mantel was still turned face down. I couldn't bring myself to set it upright again. The smiling faces captured in that frame felt like strangers now. My wife entered quietly, drying her hands on a dish towel. She must have heard every word from the other room, but she hadn't interfered. She'd always known when to step in and when to let me stand on my own. "Daniel," she said softly, placing a hand on my shoulder. I shook my head. Words stuck in my throat. She pulled out the chair beside me and sat down. For a moment, we just sat in silence, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant howl of the wind outside. Finally, I found my voice. "Do you remember the year we couldn't afford Christmas gifts? When the only thing under the tree was that wooden toy tractor I carved out of scrap wood?" Her lips curved into a faint smile. "He loved it more than anything else. Drove it around the floor until the wheels fell off." I nodded, my chest tightening. "I stayed up 3 nights, carving that thing. Worked double shifts at the mill so we could afford a turkey. And now he tells me I'm not welcome at Christmas if I don't hand over everything I've built." Tears stung my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. A man can shed blood, sweat, and years, but tears felt like weakness. Still, my voice cracked when I whispered, "What did I do wrong? Where did I fail him?" She reached across the table, her hand warm on mine. "You didn't fail him, Daniel. He made his own choices driven by greed, not by how you raised him." But the words did little to soothe the ache. My mind flooded with memories. The time I sold my old truck to cover his tuition when his scholarship fell short. The time I stayed up all night helping him finish a school project he'd procrastinated on. The time I bailed him out of debt when he was 25 and lost more money than he could afford gambling online. Each memory was a sacrifice I had made willingly, because that's what fathers do. And now he'd chosen my brother's lies over my truth. My wife stood, walked to the mantel, and picked up the face-down photo. She brushed the dust from the glass with her sleeve, then set it upright again. "Don't let them erase all the good years," she whispered. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to cling to the memories of birthday parties in the barn, of summer nights roasting marshmallows by the fire pit, of Christmas mornings when the tree barely fit in the living room because the kids wanted the biggest one we could find. But those memories felt like ghosts now, fading in the shadow of betrayal. I pushed back from the table and walked to the window. Outside, the moon cast a silver glow over the fields. The land looked calm, undisturbed, as if unaware of the war being waged over it. My father's words echoed in my head. The land remembers, son. Did it? Did it remember the nights I spent plowing until dawn? The years I went without new boots so the kids could have what they wanted? The storms I weathered alone in that barn? Did it remember that I had never once abandoned it, even when times were hard? I pressed my hand against the glass, the cold seeping into my palm. They think they can just take it, I murmured. They think words and threats make them owners. My wife's voice was firm now. Then don't let them. This farm is yours, Daniel, and it will stay yours if you stand your ground. Her words planted something in me, a seed of resolve buried under layers of grief. It wasn't strength yet, not courage, just the faint beginning of a thought. Maybe I wasn't as powerless as I felt. But that night, before resolve could grow, I allowed myself to mourn. I mourned the son I thought I had, the bond I thought was unbreakable. I mourned the brother I'd once trusted, the boy who used to race me through the fields barefoot, long before envy hardened him. I sat at the window until the first light of dawn touched the horizon, my coffee gone cold beside me, my wife asleep in her chair. The farm stretched out before me, silent and steady, and I swore to myself that if they wanted to take it from me, they would have to do more than betray me. They would have to fight the truth, because I wasn't giving up. Not yet. The days that followed were like living under a shadow. I thought, naively, that after our confrontation, my brother and my son would cool down, realize the cruelty of what they'd said, that maybe, given a little time, they'd come back with apologies, or at least some humility. But I was wrong. Instead, my brother doubled down. It started with little things, almost petty, almost laughable if they hadn't been so brazen. I walked out to the barn one morning and found him barking orders at the farmhands as if they worked for him. "Move those bales to the south side and stack them tighter this time," he snapped. The young man he was scolding looked at me with confusion, eyes wide as if to ask, "Do I listen to him or you?" I stepped into the barn, my voice low but firm. "This isn't your place to give orders." My brother turned, a smug smile spreading across his face. "Come on, Dan, you're too old to keep up. I'm just lending a hand." "By taking over?" I shot back. "By making sure things run right," he said, his tone oily. "Don't worry. You'll thank me when you see the profits." Profits. That was all he saw when he looked at the farm. Dollars and cents, not memories and meaning. He didn't see the stall where my daughter once hid with a stray kitten. He didn't see the loft where my son used to climb and call himself king of the hay. All he saw was money, and it didn't stop there. The following week, I went into town to pick up supplies. When I returned, I found the north pasture gate open, my brother standing there with two men I didn't recognize. He was gesturing toward the land, talking with his hands the way he always did when he thought he was clever. "What's going on here?" I demanded. He turned casually. "Just showing them the property. Thinking about leasing part of it out. It's wasted land anyway." "Wasted?" My voice shook with fury. "That land fed us through 3 droughts." He shrugged. "Or it could feed my pockets. Times change, Dan. You can't cling to the past forever." The men shifted uncomfortably, glancing between us. They knew something wasn't right. Still, the humiliation of it burned me to the core. My own brother, parading strangers across my land like a real estate agent. But what cut deeper was what happened at church the next Sunday. I walked in with my wife, our heads held high though my heart was heavy. I could feel the eyes on me, whispers passing from pew to pew. I caught fragments. Heard his son won't let him to Christmas. Farms changing hands. Must be hard at his age. And then, as if the whispers weren't enough, my son confirmed them. After the service, a few of the men gathered near the steps, talking about the upcoming holidays. One of them turned to me kindly and asked, "So, Dan, big plans for Christmas at the farm this year?" Before I could answer, my son stepped in, his tone loud enough for everyone to hear. "Actually, Dad won't be there. Not unless he finally decides to do the right thing about the farm." The words hung in the air like smoke. The men shifted awkwardly, some avoiding my gaze, others raising eyebrows. My wife squeezed my arm, her face pale with shame on my behalf. I wanted to shout, to tell everyone the truth, that the will was clear, that my brother was lying, that my son had turned on me. But all I could do was swallow the humiliation, my throat tight as a noose. We walked to the truck in silence, the gravel crunching beneath our feet. Once we were inside, my wife finally spoke. "Daniel, they're trying to break you down in front of everyone. They want you too ashamed to fight back." I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. "They've already broken me," I muttered. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. Broken was final. And though I felt humiliated, hollow, betrayed, there was still something in me that refused to die. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen. The house was quiet, my wife asleep in the other room. I poured myself a cup of coffee I didn't drink, just held it in my hands until it went cold. I thought about Christmas, about the glow of the tree lights, the smell of cinnamon in the oven, the laughter of children tearing open presents. For years, Christmas had been the heart of this family, the one time when all the struggles of farming life melted away into warmth and togetherness. And now my own son had turned it into a weapon. Do as we say, or you're not welcome. I stared at the cold coffee, the words echoing in my mind. The humiliation of being shut out by the very people I'd sacrificed for. The whispers in town. My brother strutting like a rooster. My son sneering at me in front of neighbors. I had never felt so small. But here's the thing about humiliation. Once the sting passes, it leaves behind something harder, something sharper, a seed of resolve. And though I didn't know it yet, that seed was about to take root. The night after church, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the old clock tick in the hallway. My wife's breathing was steady beside me, but mine felt ragged, uneven. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my brother smirking in the barn, my son sneering outside the church. Their voices echoed like a curse. "You're not welcome at Christmas. The farm is mine now." I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her, and padded down the hallway to the kitchen. The farmhouse creaked with familiar sounds, the wind against the shutters, the old pipes groaning. I poured myself a cup of coffee, though it was midnight. The liquid steamed in the lamplight, but I barely tasted it. Instead, I pulled a box from the cupboard above the sink. It was dusty, heavy, filled with old papers. For years I had kept everything: receipts, deeds, tax forms, letters from my father. I sat at the table, spreading them out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle. And there it was, the will. The original copy, signed and stamped decades ago. The words clear as day. The farm belonged to me, solely to me. I ran my fingers over my father's signature, remembering his steady hand. He had been a man of honor, of clarity. He never would have left things vague. He had known his sons. He knew one of us was steady, the other restless. He had chosen accordingly. The truth was there, in ink that hadn't faded. My brother's so-called papers were nothing but lies. And my son had chosen to side with those lies. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the will. My heart ached, but beneath the ache came something else, something steady. Resolve, I whispered aloud as if speaking to my father. They think they can take this from me. They think they can shame me into silence. But this land was yours. You gave it to me. And by God, I will not let them steal it. The farmhouse was silent, but in that silence, I felt something shift. For weeks I had been reeling, humiliated, broken, cast aside. But sitting at that table, with the will in my hands, I remembered who I was. I wasn't just an old man clinging to the past. I was the rightful owner of this farm. I was the keeper of my father's legacy. I stacked the papers neatly, slid them back into the box, and set it on the table. Tomorrow, I thought, tomorrow I will do what I should have done long ago. And so, the next morning, with frost still clinging to the grass outside, I called my lawyer. His name was Richard Evans, a man I had known for nearly 30 years. He had handled everything from property lines to insurance claims for me. If anyone could guide me through this, it was him. When he picked up, his voice was warm, but cautious. "Daniel, haven't heard from you in a while. What can I do for you?" I cleared my throat. "Richard, it's time I defended what's mine." Richard's office sat above the hardware store in town, a modest space with creaking floorboards and bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes. I'd been there countless times before, usually for mundane matters, filing taxes, reviewing insurance, renewing contracts. But this time, as I climbed the narrow stairs, my hands gripping the railing, I felt the weight of something bigger. When I walked in, Richard looked up from his desk, his glasses perched low on his nose. He smiled faintly. "Dan, you look like a man with a storm behind him. Sit down." I took a seat, pulling the worn box of papers onto his desk. "It's time, Richard. My brother claims the farm is his. My own son is siding with him. They've turned Christmas into a weapon. I'm done being humiliated." His brows furrowed, and he opened the box carefully, lifting out the documents. He scanned the will, his finger tracing the lines. "This is clear, Dan, crystal clear. The farm is yours, sole ownership. There's no legal ground for your brother to stand on." I leaned back, relief flooding me, but Richard held up a finger. "But if he's waving forged papers, we may need to take extra steps. Courts don't look kindly on fraud. If it comes to that, we'll expose it." I nodded slowly. "Expose him. Yes, but I also need to think beyond that. My son, he's made it clear where he stands. If I leave things as they are, when I'm gone, the farm will pass straight into his hands, and I can't risk him selling it off, or letting my brother weasel his way back in." Richard's expression softened. "You're talking about restructuring the inheritance." "Yes," I said firmly. "I want the farm to go to my grandchildren directly, an educational trust, college, training, whatever they need. But not to him, not to my brother, not to anyone who would bleed this land dry." He nodded, jotting notes on a legal pad. "That's wise. We can establish a trust managed by a third-party trustee. That way, your son and brother will have no access. The children will be provided for, but the farm itself stays protected." Hearing the words gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in weeks. For so long, I had carried the weight of betrayal alone. Now, with Richard's calm voice explaining the law, I felt the ground steady beneath me. We spent the next hour reviewing every document: deeds, titles, insurance policies. Richard pointed out vulnerabilities and patched them with plans. He explained how a forged claim would collapse under scrutiny, how restraining orders could be filed if intimidation escalated, how ironclad the trust could be if done properly. As he spoke, I realized something. For weeks I had been reacting, stumbling from one humiliation to the next, letting their cruelty dictate my mood. But here, with papers and law on my side, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. I left his office with a folder of documents tucked under my arm and a strange sense of calm in my chest. When I stepped out onto Main Street, the winter air bit my face, but it felt refreshing, almost invigorating. I was no longer a man beaten down. I was a man ready to fight, not with fists or fury, but with truth and law. That evening at supper, I told my wife everything. Her eyes glistened with relief as I laid the folder on the table. "It's started," I told her. "The farm will be secured. The children will be protected. And neither my brother nor my son will touch what they don't deserve." She reached across the table, her fingers curling over mine. "I knew you'd find your strength again." Strength. Yes. Not the kind that comes from lifting hay bales or mending fences, but the kind that comes from drawing a line in the sand and saying, "No more." Christmas was coming. And this year, I wouldn't walk in with my head bowed. I would walk in with the will and the law. The days crept toward Christmas like a drumbeat, each one heavier than the last. The town dressed itself in garlands and lights, but for me, the season had never felt darker. I drove through Main Street one afternoon, watching families carrying pine trees in the backs of their trucks, children running with candy canes, laughter spilling from the cafe windows. Every sight reminded me of what Christmas used to be on the farm. I remembered the smell of cinnamon rolls in the oven, my wife humming carols as she dusted powdered sugar across them. I remembered the kids racing down the stairs in their pajamas, their eyes wide at the sight of the tree glowing in the corner, ornaments glinting in the light of dawn. I remembered carving the turkey while my brother told jokes, back when he was just family, not an enemy. Those memories ached now, like pressing on a bruise. This year my brother had turned the holiday into a battlefield. My son had turned it into a weapon. Do what we say, or you don't come. But they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know about the will I had found, the trust being set up, the lawyer who had promised me that justice would hold. For weeks I prepared quietly. Richard, my lawyer, called often. We refined the paperwork, sealed the trust, and prepared copies of the will. "Be ready for confrontation," he warned. "Your brother will bluster. Your son may lash out, but the truth will silence them." At night, I sat at the kitchen table, polishing my old boots, pressing my shirt, folding the coat I would wear. Not because I cared about appearances, but because I wanted to walk into that house not as a broken man, but as the man my father had raised, dignity intact, head held high. My wife, ever steady, asked me once, "Are you sure you want to go? They've made it clear how they feel." I looked at her, my hands resting on the folder of papers. "Yes, I have to go. Not for them, for me, for the land, for the grandchildren who deserve better than this greed." She nodded, though worry shadowed her eyes. Christmas Eve came with snowflakes drifting through the air, soft and silent. I loaded the folder into my truck, tucking it beneath the seat. Richard met me at the gate, dressed in his long wool coat, carrying his briefcase. His nod was steady, reassuring. "Ready, Dan?" he asked. I tightened my grip on the wheel. "I've been ready my whole life." As we drove toward my son's house, the place where Christmas dinner was to be held, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me. All the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights, all the laughter, all the pain. And now it had come to this, a confrontation not with strangers, but with family. But I wasn't walking in alone. I was walking in with truth, with the law, with my father's signature, still bold on that page. The house glowed with warm lights strung across the porch, laughter spilling out even before we reached the door. For a moment, standing in the snow, I almost turned back, almost let them have their hollow victory. But then I felt the folder beneath my arm, and I knocked. The door swung open, and there stood my son. His smile froze the moment he saw Richard beside me, briefcase in hand. "Dad," he said flatly, "what's this?" I stepped inside, stamping the snow from my boots. "This," I said evenly, "is Christmas. And I'm here, whether you like it or not." The room fell quiet as we entered. The family gathered around the long table, plates steaming with food, glasses filled with wine. My brother sat at the head, puffed up like a rooster, his face smug. "Well, well," he drawled. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to show up, Dan." I laid the folder on the table, its thud sharp in the silence. "I came to set things right." My brother chuckled, raising his glass. "Set things right? By giving up what's mine? Go ahead. Admit it in front of everyone. Then maybe we can eat in peace." I looked at him, then at my son. My boy couldn't even meet my eyes. Slowly, I opened the folder and drew out the will, the paper crisp despite its age. I laid it flat on the table, my finger pressing against my father's signature. "This farm," I said, my voice steady, "was left to me. By law, by blood, by the sweat of every day I spent working it. And no forged paper, no threats, no banishment from Christmas will ever change that." The room was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. My brother leaned forward, his face reddening. "That's a lie. I've got my own papers." Richard stepped forward then, opening his briefcase. His voice was calm, professional, but firm enough to cut through the silence. "Those so-called papers of yours won't stand in any court. They're forgeries, plain and simple. This will is the original, signed and notarized, legally binding, irrefutable." Gas rippled around the table. My son's wife put a hand to her mouth. My grandchildren stared wide-eyed, sensing the weight of the moment, even if they didn't fully understand it. My brother sputtered, "You think you can humiliate me here? On Christmas?" I leaned forward, my voice low. "You did that to yourself the moment you tried to steal what was never yours." Richard pulled out another document, sliding it across the table toward my son. "And as for you, your father has restructured the inheritance. The farm will go into trust for the grandchildren. You have no control, no access. The land is secured." My son's face drained of color. He looked at me then, finally, his eyes wide, with something between shock and betrayal. "Dad, you'd cut me out." I swallowed hard. "No, son. You cut yourself out the day you chose greed over family. The day you told me I wasn't welcome at Christmas. Actions have consequences. And this is yours." The silence that followed was suffocating. My brother slammed his glass down, wine spilling across the table. He pushed back his chair and stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. The front door slammed behind him, rattling the windows. My son remained seated, his hands trembling on the table. But he had no words, not one. I stood then, gathering the will back into the folder. My voice carried across the room, quiet but final. "I came here tonight not to beg for a place at this table, but to remind you all of the truth. The farm is mine. The legacy is secure, and dignity cannot be stolen." No one moved. No one spoke. And in that silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Strength. The sound of the front door slamming behind my brother echoed through the house, rattling the very picture frames on the walls. For a moment, no one breathed. The laughter that had filled the room only minutes earlier had been replaced with something colder, heavier, a silence so sharp it felt like glass. All eyes turned toward me, some wide with shock, some filled with pity, others simply stunned into stillness. My grandchildren stared, their forks frozen midair. My daughter-in-law sat stiff, her cheeks flushed crimson, and my son, my only son, looked as if the ground had been yanked out from under him. He opened his mouth once, twice, but no words came. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his hands trembling where they rested on the table. I had seen him cry as a child, shout in anger as a teenager, even glare in defiance as a young man. But I had never seen him like this, stripped bare, his arrogance shattered. Richard, my lawyer, remained steady at my side. His voice was calm, measured, professional. "The documents are clear. Mr. Carr," he glanced at me, "is the rightful owner. Any attempts to challenge that with forged papers will result in legal consequences, including fraud charges. That is the law." The weight of his words hung heavy. Oh, fraud. Charges. The kind of words that don't just sting for a day, but sting for a lifetime. My son finally found his voice, though it came out broken, uneven. "Dad, you didn't have to humiliate us like this. Not here. Not on Christmas." I stared at him, my heart aching even as steel ran through my veins. "I didn't humiliate you, son. You did that yourself when you told me I wasn't welcome in my own family. You brought this on yourself when you tried to erase me from the very table I built." Gas rippled through the room again, and my son's eyes darted toward the grandchildren as if hoping for sympathy. But even they seemed to sense the truth. Children have a way of cutting through lies. They just stared, confused but silent, their innocence caught in the storm of adult greed. My daughter-in-law finally spoke, her voice trembling. "This isn't right, Daniel. He's your son. Surely you wouldn't—" I cut her off gently but firmly. "He is my son, and I love him still. But love does not mean turning a blind eye to betrayal. Love does not mean letting him and his uncle strip away what generations before me built with their hands. Love does not mean surrendering dignity for the sake of avoiding discomfort." The truth hung in the air, undeniable. My son slumped back into his chair, his shoulders sagging. For the first time, I saw him not as a boy who had grown tall, but as a man who had chosen poorly, who had gambled with loyalty and lost. Neighbors would hear of this. They would talk about it in hushed tones, at the cafe, at the feed store, at church. My brother would be branded a liar, his forgeries exposed. My son would be known as the boy who sided against his father, only to be cut off. Humiliation is a heavy burden, but it wasn't mine to carry any more. I gathered the will and tucked it back into the folder. Richard closed his briefcase with a firm snap. My work here was done. But before I left, I looked around the room one last time. At the family who had once shared laughter and warmth with me every Christmas. At the table that had once symbolized unity and love, now fractured by greed. And I said quietly, almost to myself, but loud enough for all to hear, "Family is not defined by who shares your blood. It's defined by who stands with you when the storm comes." No one answered. No one could. As I walked toward the door, my wife at my side, Richard steady behind us, I felt their eyes follow me, my son's most of all. But he didn't speak again. Perhaps he couldn't. And for the first time in weeks, I walked not as a man broken, but as a man vindicated. The night air hit my face as I stepped out of that house, cold and sharp, but it felt cleaner than the air I had breathed inside. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward the truck, the folder tucked under my arm like a shield. My wife slipped her hand into mine, her grip steady, grounding me. Richard patted my shoulder before climbing into his own car. "You did well, Dan. You held your ground." I nodded, though the ache in my chest lingered. Winning a battle doesn't erase the wounds. The drive home was quiet, the headlights cutting through the falling snow. My wife reached across the seat and held my hand, and for the first time in weeks, I felt peace creeping back in. When we reached the farmhouse, the sight of it in the moonlight nearly broke me. The old porch, the barn standing proud, the field stretching out beneath the stars, it was all still there, untouched by lies, unmoved by betrayal. The land didn't care about my brother's schemes or my son's cruelty. The land remembered me. We lit a small fire in the hearth, sat together in the glow. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, comforting. For supper, we had leftovers and a slice of pie. Simple, honest, ours, and that was enough. The next morning, Christmas Day, I rose early. I walked the fields alone, the snow crunching beneath my boots. The air was crisp, the sky painted with soft pinks and golds. I paused by the old oak at the edge of the south pasture, laying a hand against its rough bark. My father once told me here, under this very tree, that a man is measured not by what he gains, but by what he protects. I finally understood what he meant. I couldn't protect my son from his own greed. I couldn't protect my brother from his envy. But I could protect the land. I could protect the legacy. I could protect the future. For the grandchildren who would one day walk these fields with their own laughter, their own dreams. In the weeks that followed, the news spread quickly. My brother's forged papers were dismissed by the lawyer as fraudulent. Word reached the community, and whispers turned against him. No one trusts a man who tries to steal from his own blood. As for my son, the humiliation of that night lingered. He called once, his voice tight, asking if there was a way back into the inheritance. I told him gently but firmly, "The farm is for your children now. If you want their future secure, stand by them. But as for you, son, you made your choice." There was silence on the other end. Then the line went dead. It hurt, of course it hurt. A father's love doesn't just vanish. But love without respect is a hollow thing. And I was done being hollow. The trust was finalized by February. The farm, the house, the land, everything was secured in the name of the grandchildren. They would be cared for, their education guaranteed, their future rooted in the same soil that had raised me. And I found peace again. Some evenings I sit on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunset paint the fields gold. My wife sits beside me, knitting, the quiet between us soft and familiar. Sometimes the grandchildren visit, their laughter carrying across the yard. And in those moments, I know I made the right choice. I lost a brother to envy. I lost a son to greed. But I gained something greater. The certainty that my legacy is safe, that my dignity remains intact, and that the land will remember me long after I'm gone. As I tell you this now, I leave you with one truth. Betrayal may cut deep, but justice, when earned, heals deeper. And when I showed up with the lawyer and the will, I didn't just reclaim my farm. I reclaimed myself.